Territory was stripped away. The army was reduced to a shadow of itself. The navy dismantled. The air force erased from existence. And above all, Germany alone was blamed for a war that had consumed all of Europe. The treaty did not feel like peace. It felt like punishment. Reparations crushed the economy. Inflation devoured savings overnight. A loaf of bread cost millions of marks. Fathers watched their life's work become worthless paper. Mothers traded family heirlooms for food. This was not abstract politics. This was daily survival and humiliation, constant public, international, cut deeper than hunger. Germany was told, you are guilty, you are dangerous, you must never rise again. But history teaches us something uncomfortable. A defeated nation does not forget. It waits. Fear of collapse, chaos inside Germany. By the 1920s and early 1930s, Germany was not just broken. It was unstable. Democracy felt fragile. Governments collapsed one after another. Street violence became normal. Communists and extremists fought openly. Assassinations were common. Civil war felt possible. To many Germans, the Weimar Republic was not freedom. It was weakness. And beyond Germany's borders, fear grew louder. The Russian Revolution had already turned one empire into a communist state. Germany's elites, industrialists, generals, landowners, looked east and saw what they believed was coming next. They feared not invasion, but collapse from within. In their eyes, Germany faced a choice: be torn apart by ideology and foreign pressure, or seize control of its destiny by force. Fear, more than ambition, became the fuel. The world looks away. Opportunity through silence. The 1930s were not just Germany's crisis. They were a global one. The Great Depression shattered economies everywhere. Britain struggled. France hesitated. America turned inward. And in that silence, Germany noticed something important. No one was stopping it. When Germany rearmed, no response. When it remilitarized the Rhineland, no response. When it united with Austria, no response. Each step was illegal. Each step violated treaties, but each step succeeded. And success teaches dangerous lessons. It taught Germany that the post-World War order was weak, that treaties could be ignored, that power, not law, shaped reality. War no longer seemed impossible. It began to feel inevitable. Strategic panic, surrounded and strangled. Geography matters in war, and Germany's geography bred fear. Germany sat in the center of Europe, surrounded by potential enemies. France to the west, Poland to the east, the Soviet Union looming beyond. To German military planners, this meant only one thing. If war came, it would come from all sides. Germany lacked colonies, raw materials, oil, and food security. Its economy depended on imports that could be cut off by blockade, just as they had been in World War I. The memory was still fresh. Starving civilians, empty factories, soldiers fighting while families at home collapsed. To German leadership, delay meant weakness. They believed that if war was unavoidable, it had to be started on Germany's terms, not its enemies'. This was not confidence, it was urgency, a belief that time itself was the enemy. Ideology meets desperation. Then came the ideology that gave fear a voice. Nationalism promised pride, militarism promised strength, expansion promised survival. The message was simple and terrifyingly effective. Germany was not aggressive, it was defending its future, defending against humiliation, defending against encirclement, defending against economic strangulation, defending against ideological destruction. War was reframed not as conquest but as necessity. And when a nation believes war is necessary, morality becomes flexible, opposition becomes betrayal, peace becomes weakness. At that moment, the path to war narrows until it feels like the only road left. The final step, when war became inevitable, by the late 1930s, Germany stood at a crossroads, but both paths led to conflict. Continue expanding and risk war. Stop expanding and risk collapse. To German leadership, stopping meant economic suffocation, loss of momentum, internal rebellion, strategic vulnerability. So they chose movement over pause, attack over hesitation, war now rather than war later. And once the first shots were fired, there was no turning back. The machine had begun to move. The tragic truth of history. Here's the hardest truth to accept. Germany did not start the war because it loved war. It started the war because it feared the alternative. Fear of weakness, fear of humiliation, fear of being crushed again. Slowly, quietly, permanently. This does not absolve the destruction that followed. It does not erase responsibility, but it explains the psychology of a nation pushed to believe that survival required violence. History is not driven only by villains and heroes. It is driven by fear, memory, pride, and pressure. And when those forces collide, the world burns. Closing reflection. War is rarely born from strength. It is born from insecurity. Germany's war began long before tanks crossed borders. It began in bread lines, in treaty rooms, in broken economies, in wounded pride. And if history teaches us anything, it is this. When peace humiliates instead of heals, when fear replaces dialogue, when nations are cornered rather than rebuilt, war does not arrive suddenly. It arrives inevitably. In 1918, Germany did not simply lose a war. It lost its sense of place in the world. The guns fell silent, but what followed was not relief. It was a slow, grinding reckoning imposed through paper and signatures rather than artillery. The Treaty of Versailles arrived not as reconciliation, but as judgment. And for millions of Germans, it felt less like peace and more like a verdict delivered without appeal. The nation that had once stood among Europe's great powers was forced to bow, not only militarily, but psychologically, economically, and morally, in ways that reached deep into everyday life. The treaty declared Germany solely responsible for the catastrophe of the First World War, a claim that ignored the shared failures and ambitions of all the great powers. This single clause carried immense symbolic weight. It told an entire population that their suffering, their dead, and their ruin were not tragic consequences of a shared disaster, but the rightful punishment for collective guilt, for veterans who had endured the trenches, for families who had lost sons and fathers. This accusation cut like an open wound. They had not experienced themselves as villains. In 1914, they had believed they were defending their country, just as others had believed the same of theirs. Now, history itself seemed to condemn them. The territorial losses deepened the sense of dismemberment. Alsace-Lorraine returned to France. Large swaths of land were given to the newly created Poland. German-speaking communities found themselves suddenly living under foreign flags. Borders that had taken generations to define were erased in conference rooms far from the people they affected. To many Germans, this felt like the tearing away of flesh, not lines on a map. It was a reminder, every time a train crossed a new frontier, that Germany was smaller, weaker, and watched. Military restrictions were perhaps the most humiliating blow of all. The German army, once a central pillar of national identity, was reduced to 100,000 men. Conscription was banned. Tanks, aircraft, and submarines were forbidden. The Navy was scuttled by its own sailors rather than surrendered, a final act of defiance that only underscored how deeply honor and shame were intertwined. For a society that had long equated strength with security, these limits felt like enforced vulnerability. Germany was told it could not defend itself even in theory and had to trust the goodwill of nations that had just crushed it. Then there was the economic burden, the most relentless and intimate form of punishment. Reparations were imposed at levels so high that even economists of the time questioned their feasibility. The payments were not abstract numbers. They translated into taxes, shortages, and austerity that touched every household. The government printed money to meet obligations, and the result was hyperinflation so severe it defied comprehension. Savi. Enges vanished overnight. Wages became meaningless. People carried wheelbarrows of banknotes to buy basic goods, only to find prices had doubled by the afternoon. Middle-class stability, built over generations, dissolved into panic and resentment. This economic collapse was not experienced as a temporary crisis, but as a betrayal. Many Germans felt abandoned by their leaders and exploited by foreign powers. The new democratic government, born from defeat, was associated in the public mind with weakness and submission. Democracy itself became linked to humiliation, while authoritarian promises of strength and order gained emotional appeal. The treaty had not only damaged Germany's economy, it had poisoned faith in the political system meant to rebuild it. The psychological impact of Versailles cannot be separated from the myths that grew around it. One of the most dangerous was the so-called stab in the back legend, the belief that Germany had not truly been defeated on the battlefield, but betrayed by politicians, civilians, and internal enemies. This narrative thrived because it offered something the treaty did not: dignity. It allowed people to believe that their army was undefeated, that their sacrifice had meaning, and that their suffering was the result of treachery rather than failure. While false, this belief spread easily in a society desperate to reclaim honor. Internationally, Germany was isolated and mistrusted. It was excluded from the League of Nations for years, treated as a pariah rather than a partner in rebuilding Europe. Diplomatic humiliation reinforced the sense that the post-war order was designed not for stability, but for permanent German weakness. Every conference, every demand for payment, every foreign inspection of factories or ports served as a reminder that sovereignty itself had been compromised. Over time, this combination of blame, loss, poverty, and exclusion created a collective memory defined by resentment. Children grew up hearing stories of hunger and disgrace. Veterans spoke of comrades who had died for nothing. Teachers, newspapers, and political movements revisited the treaty again and again, framing it as an injustice that had to be corrected. Versailles became more than a historical document. It became a symbol of everything that had gone wrong, a shorthand for suffering that could be invoked to explain any hardship. What made the treaty especially dangerous was that it punished without reconciling. It demanded submission, but offered no genuine path to restored equality. Germany was expected to accept its reduced status indefinitely, to remain disarmed while others retained power, to pay for destruction while rebuilding itself from ruins. This imbalance fostered the belief that the international system was fundamentally unfair, that law was merely a tool of the strong, and that only strength could undo humiliation. As the years passed, the memory of Versailles did not fade, it hardened. Economic crises came and went, but the sense of injustice endured. Each downturn revived old anger. Each political failure seemed to confirm that the post-war order was a dead end. For many Germans, the treaty explained not just past defeat, but present misery and future fear, shaping a worldview in which restoration of pride and power became inseparable from survival itself. Germany, in the years after the First World War, was a nation standing on unstable ground, where order felt temporary and collapse always seemed one crisis away. The empire had fallen, the old certainties had vanished, and in their place stood a fragile republic struggling to convince its people that it could offer stability, dignity, or hope. For many Germans, daily life was shaped less by optimism than by anxiety, a constant awareness that the country's political and social fabric might tear apart at any moment. The Weimar Republic was born not through triumph, but through defeat, and that origin haunted it. From the beginning, it was associated with surrender, with the signing of an unpopular treaty, and with the dismantling of institutions that had once symbolized strength. Parliamentary debates and coalition governments felt distant and ineffective to citizens accustomed to firm authority. When governments fell every few months and policies shifted with each election, democracy came to be seen not as representation, but as chaos. Political violence filled the streets. Armed groups on the far left and far right clashed openly, turning cities into battlegrounds. Communist uprisings erupted in major industrial regions inspired by the recent success of the Bolsheviks in Russia. Workers occupied factories. Red flags appeared on city halls for landowners, industrialists, and the middle class. These events were not abstract ideological disputes. They were existential threats. They imagined their property seized, their traditions erased, their families dragged into revolution. At the same time, right-wing paramilitary groups formed from disillusioned veterans who felt discarded by the very nation they had fought for. These men were trained in violence, bonded by shared trauma, and deeply resentful. They carried their war into peacetime, believing that the struggle had not ended but merely shifted inward. Assassinations became disturbingly common, targeting politicians, journalists, and anyone seen as an enemy of the nation. Law and order seemed powerless to stop the bloodshed. Economic instability amplified every fear. Hyperinflation destroyed trust not only in money, but in the state itself. When savings vanished and wages lost meaning, people turned away from institutions that promised stability and toward movements that promised certainty. Later, when the global economic depression struck, unemployment soared to unprecedented levels. Millions were thrown out of work, and the social safety net proved insufficient to catch them. Desperation became a political force, driving people toward extremes. Within this environment, the fear of ideological collapse loomed large. Communism was not merely an opposing viewpoint. It was perceived as an existential menace that threatened to dismantle society from the inside. The memory of Russia's revolution haunted Germany's elites, who saw parallels in strikes, protests, and radical rhetoric. To them, the state appeared under siege, attacked not by foreign armies, but by ideas that could unravel it completely. The military, though officially weakened by treaty, remained a powerful cultural presence. Officers and strategists believed that Germany's defeat had been caused not only by enemy strength, but by internal disunity. They concluded that a nation divided could not survive in a hostile world. Unity, discipline, and obedience became values elevated above compromise and debate. Militarism offered a vision of order in contrast to the perceived disorder of civilian politics. As democratic institutions faltered, authoritarian solutions gained appeal. Strong leadership promised decisiveness where parliaments stalled. Uniforms, marches, and symbols projected confidence in a time of uncertainty. For many, these displays were reassuring, suggesting that someone was finally in control. Militarism was not initially embraced as aggression, but as a stabilizing force, a means to impose order on chaos and to restore a sense of national purpose. The fear of collapse also shaped Germany's view of its future. Surrounded by hostile or suspicious neighbors and burdened by economic constraints, the country appeared vulnerable. Internal division was seen as an invitation to external domination. Political pluralism, instead of being valued as strength, was portrayed as weakness that enemies could exploit. In this narrative, survival required not debate, but unity enforced from above. This mindset gradually normalized the idea that extraordinary measures were justified by extraordinary circumstances. Civil liberties could be limited in the name of security. Opposition could be silenced in the name of unity. Violence, once confined to the margins, began to feel like an acceptable tool when the stakes were framed as national survival. The boundary between defense and aggression blurred as fear reshaped moral calculations. By the early 1930s, many Germans no longer believed that the existing system could protect them from economic ruin, ideological takeover, or social collapse. Militarism, once associated primarily with the army, expanded into a broader cultural principle emphasizing discipline, hierarchy, and readiness for conflict. It promised clarity in a world that felt dangerously uncertain. What emerged was not a sudden turn toward war, but a slow hardening of attitudes. Each crisis reinforced the belief that compromise led to weakness, and that strength, even harsh strength, was necessary to hold the nation together. Internal instability became inseparable from external ambition, as leaders and citizens alike began to see force not only as a means of defense, but as the only reliable foundation upon which order and survival could be built. In the years after the First World War, the international system was built on fragile promises and exhausted resolve. The nations that emerged victorious were tired, financially strained, and deeply unwilling to repeat the catastrophe they had just survived. Their publics demanded peace at almost any cost, and their leaders learned quickly that confrontation, even in defensive treaties, was politically dangerous. Into this atmosphere stepped Germany, watching closely, testing boundaries not with armies at first, but with calculations. The early violations were cautious, almost tentative. Rearmament began quietly, disguised as police forces and civilian programs. Military training took place in secrecy, often abroad. These were not grand gestures meant to provoke immediate response, but small steps designed to measure the will of others. Each time Germany moved, it waited. Each time the response was limited to protests, notes of concern, or diplomatic warnings that carried no real consequences. This pattern sent a powerful message. Treaties, it seemed, were only as strong as the willingness to enforce them, and that willingness was fading. Britain and France, haunted by the memory of millions of dead, prioritized stability over confrontation. They feared that pressing Germany too hard would either collapse its fragile political system or ignite another war they were not prepared to fight. The desire to avoid conflict became a vulnerability that Germany's leadership learned to exploit. When German troops marched into the Rhineland in 1936, it was a direct violation of the post-war settlement. Militarily, the move was risky. German forces had orders to retreat if faced with resistance. Politically, however, it was a gamble based on observation. German leaders believed that France, despite having the stronger army at that moment, would not act without British support, and that Britain would urge restraint. They were correct. No soldiers intervened. No sanctions followed. What should have been a moment of decisive enforcement instead became a moment of realization. That realization reshaped German thinking. The absence of resistance was interpreted not as patience, but as weakness. It confirmed the belief that the old powers lacked the will to defend the system they had created. Each successful violation reinforced the lesson that boldness paid off, while hesitation invited pressure. The risks of action appeared lower than the risks of restraint. This dynamic extended beyond borders and troops. Diplomatic negotiations themselves became tools of delay and manipulation. Agreements were signed with little intention of honoring them, serving instead to buy time and create an image of reasonableness. Meanwhile, rearmament accelerated, and public confidence grew. Within Germany, these successes were presented as victories not just over foreign powers, but over the humiliation of the past, restoring pride and belief in national destiny. The policy of appeasement, driven by fear of war and overconfidence in diplomacy, played a central role in this process. Concessions were made in the hope that grievances could be satisfied peacefully, that revisions to the post-war order would stabilize Europe. But each concession altered the balance of perception. What was meant as compromise was seen as retreat. What was intended to preserve peace instead undermined the credibility of deterrence. The annexation of Austria demonstrated this shift with striking clarity. The move violated international agreements and ignored Austrian sovereignty, yet it unfolded with little more than diplomatic protest. For Germany, this was not merely a territorial gain. It was proof that national will could override international law without triggering immediate consequences. The idea that borders were fixed and protected dissolved further, replaced by a sense that reality belonged to those prepared to seize it. Czechoslovakia followed its fate, sealed not by German tanks alone, but by negotiations in which its allies chose agreement over confrontation. The Munich settlement was celebrated in some quarters as a triumph of peace, but in Berlin it was understood differently. It confirmed that threats could achieve what force alone might not, and that the international community was willing to sacrifice smaller states to avoid a larger conflict. The psychological impact of this understanding was profound. Inside Germany, these developments transformed internal debates. Those who had warned against recklessness lost influence, while advocates of expansion gained credibility. Success created momentum, and momentum reshaped strategy. The leadership no longer saw itself as constrained by the post-war system, but as actively dismantling it. The world, by failing to respond decisively, had become a participant in this transformation. The lack of response also affected military planning. German strategists, observing the hesitation of potential opponents, began to believe that rapid, decisive action could outpace diplomacy and prevent coordinated resistance. The idea took hold that wars could be won before enemies fully mobilized, that shock and speed could compensate for material disadvantages. This belief encouraged risk-taking, making aggressive strategies appear not only possible but rational. Public opinion within Germany followed the same trajectory. Each unchallenged move strengthened faith in leadership and in the belief that history was turning in Germany's favor. International law and moral criticism mattered less than visible results. Pride replaced doubt and confidence replaced caution. The memory of past defeat was gradually overshadowed by a sense of resurgence fueled by apparent success. What emerged was a dangerous feedback loop. Global inaction encouraged German assertiveness, which in turn normalized further inaction. The longer this pattern continued, the harder it became to break without war. By the time opposition stiffened, the assumptions on which restraint had been based no longer applied. Germany no longer believed that its opponents would act decisively, and that belief shaped every subsequent decision. The world's silence was not empty. It spoke clearly to those who listened. It told German leaders that the international order lacked teeth, that moral outrage did not translate into force, and that opportunities existed for those willing to challenge the status quo. In this environment, aggression was reframed not as recklessness, but as strategic realism, a necessary response to a system that appeared unwilling or unable to defend itself. Germany's sense of urgency before the war was shaped not only by ideology or diplomacy, but by cold calculations rooted in geography and memory. Situated in the heart of Europe, Germany had long been aware of its vulnerability. Unlike island nations or empires with distant buffers, it had borders on all sides, many of them with states that either distrusted or openly feared it. This central position created a persistent anxiety. In a major conflict, Germany would likely face enemies from multiple directions at once. That fear was not theoretical. It was a memory still alive in the minds of soldiers, officers, and civilians who had lived through the First World War. Germany's defeat in 1918 was not remembered simply as a battlefield loss, but as a slow suffocation. The Allied naval blockade had cut off food, raw materials, and fuel, strangling the home front while the war was still being fought. Civilians starved. Children grew up malnourished. Factories slowed and stopped not because of enemy shells, but because coal, rubber, oil, and grain could no longer reach them. For German planners, this experience left a lasting scar. After the war, those fears intensified rather than faded. Germany had lost its overseas colonies, which meant it lacked direct access to many essential raw materials. It had limited domestic oil, insufficient iron ore of high quality, and a population too large to be comfortably fed by its own farmland alone. The nation depended heavily on imports to survive in peacetime, let alone in war. Every shipment that crossed its borders was a reminder of vulnerability. Every foreign supplier a potential pressure point. Strategically, the situation looked even more alarming. France, though scarred by war, remained determined to prevent German resurgence and maintained a strong military posture along the western border. To the east, a newly independent Poland stood between Germany and the Soviet Union, creating unresolved territorial tensions and cutting Germany off from lands it had once controlled. Beyond Poland loomed the Soviet Union itself, vast, unpredictable, and ideologically hostile. From Berlin's perspective, the possibility of a two-front war was not a distant nightmare, but a recurring historical pattern. German military thinkers returned again and again to this problem. They believed that time favored Germany's enemies, not Germany. France could rely on alliances and colonial resources. Britain controlled the seas and could impose another blockade. The Soviet Union was industrializing rapidly, growing stronger with each passing year. Germany, by contrast, felt boxed in, its economy exposed and its strategic position precarious. Waiting in this worldview was not neutral, it was dangerous. The memory of the First World War blockade shaped these calculations profoundly. It convinced German leaders that future war would not be decided only by armies clashing at the front, but by economies collapsing behind the lines. Survival would depend on access to food, fuel, and materials, and on the ability to deny those same resources to enemies. This belief pushed German strategy toward expansion, not as an abstract desire for conquest, but as a perceived requirement for self-sufficiency. Food security was a central concern. Germany's population had grown significantly, and memories of hunger were still raw. Agricultural output alone could not guarantee stability in a prolonged crisis. Planners spoke openly about the need for secure farmland beyond Germany's borders, land that could not be cut off by naval power. The idea that a nation could starve into submission haunted every serious strategic discussion. Oil was an even more critical weakness. Modern warfare depended on fuel for tanks, aircraft, and mechanized transport. Yet Germany possessed almost none of its own. Synthetic fuel production offered partial relief, but required time, investment, and uninterrupted industrial output. In the event of blockade or bombing, these facilities would be vulnerable. Securing access to oil-rich regions became not just desirable, but, in the minds of planners, essential. These material concerns fed into a broader sense of encirclement. Germany's leaders increasingly believed that hostile powers were closing in, tightening a ring that would eventually snap shut. Alliances among its neighbors, defensive on paper, were interpreted as preparations for future aggression. Military exercises across borders were watched closely, often exaggerated into evidence of imminent threat. In such an atmosphere, worst-case scenarios dominated thinking. The concept of preemptive action emerged from this mindset. If Germany waited until enemies were fully prepared, fully armed, and fully coordinated, defeat seemed certain. If it acted sooner, while opponents hesitated or remained divided, there might be a chance to break the encirclement and secure strategic depth. Speed became a substitute for resources, initiative a substitute for numbers. This logic transformed Germany's understanding of war itself. Conflict was no longer seen as a last resort after diplomacy failed, but as a race against time. Each year that passed without action was viewed as a year in which Germany's relative position worsened. Rearmament by others, industrial growth elsewhere, and diplomatic alignments all fed the sense that the window for decisive action was narrowing. Civilian leaders absorbed these arguments alongside military ones. Economic planners warned that dependence on foreign trade made Germany vulnerable to pressure even short of war. Diplomats noted that political isolation limited options for negotiation. Together, these assessments created a climate in which caution looked irresponsible and restraint appeared suicidal. Public discourse reflected these fears in simplified form. Newspapers spoke of being surrounded by enemies. Politicians warned of strangulation and decline. The language of survival entered everyday conversation, framing international politics as a struggle in which only the strong endured. In such a narrative, preparation for war felt less like aggression and more like self-defense. What made this mindset especially dangerous was how it collapsed future uncertainty into present urgency. Hypothetical threats were treated as inevitable, and inevitable threats demanded immediate response. The longer Germany contemplated its strategic position, the more it convinced itself that delay equaled defeat, and that decisive action, however risky, was preferable to passive decline. In this way, geography, resources, and memory combined to produce a sense of strategic panic. Germany did not see itself as choosing war freely, but as reacting to an environment that offered no safe alternatives. Encirclement was not merely a military concept, but a psychological one, shaping how leaders interpreted every move by other states and every constraint on German power. The shadow of past starvation, the fear of blockade, and the belief that enemies were growing stronger by the day all converged into a single conclusion. If conflict was coming, it had to come sooner rather than later, before Germany was once again trapped, cut off, and forced to endure a slow collapse without the means to resist. Fear alone does not drive a nation to war unless it is given meaning, and in Germany that meaning was supplied by an ideology that transformed anxiety into purpose. Nationalism, shaped by loss and humiliation, promised to restore dignity. Militarism promised order where chaos reigned. Expansion promised security in a world perceived as hostile. Together, these ideas did not emerge as abstract theories, but as emotional answers to a society struggling to make sense of its suffering. National identity had been fractured by defeat. The empire was gone, the symbols of power dismantled, and the narrative of greatness replaced with one of guilt. Many Germans experienced this not as a correction of history, but as an erasure of self-worth. Ideology stepped into that void, offering a story in which the nation was not evil, but wronged, not defeated, but restrained, not dangerous, but endangered. This reframing mattered deeply because it allowed pride to coexist with pain. Militarism became central to this identity, not because Germans were inherently aggressive, but because military values appeared to offer stability. Discipline, hierarchy, and obedience contrasted sharply with the perceived disorder of parliamentary politics and street violence. Uniforms and rituals created a sense of belonging. Marches and formations replaced confusion with structure. For a population exhausted by uncertainty, this aesthetic of strength felt reassuring. Expansionist thinking grew from these foundations. It was presented not as conquest, but as correction. The reclaiming of space, resources, and influence believed to have been unjustly denied. Ideologues argued that a nation of Germany's size and population could not survive confined within its post-war borders. They spoke of economic suffocation, demographic pressure, and strategic vulnerability, weaving material concerns into a moral narrative of entitlement and survival. What made this ideology especially powerful was how it fused emotion with necessity. Pride alone might have led to protest or revisionism. Fear alone might have led to caution. Together, they produced urgency. The message was not simply that Germany deserved more, but that without action it would face decline, starvation, or domination. War was framed as a defensive act against an unforgiving world rather than an aggressive choice. This fusion reshaped moral boundaries. Traditional distinctions between right and wrong blurred under the weight of survival rhetoric. Actions once considered unacceptable were justified as temporary measures in extraordinary times. Opposition was recast as weakness, dissent as betrayal. The idea that unity was essential for survival allowed ideological conformity to be enforced with increasing severity. The appeal of this worldview extended beyond political elites. Ordinary citizens, struggling with unemployment, insecurity, and loss of status, found meaning in narratives that elevated their suffering into part of a larger national struggle. Personal hardship became evidence of collective injustice. Individual sacrifice was linked to national rebirth. In this way, ideology transformed despair into participation. Fear of enemies played a crucial role in sustaining this mindset. External threats were exaggerated and simplified, portrayed as implacable forces determined to keep Germany weak. Internal opponents were linked to these external enemies, accused of undermining the nation from within. Constant sense of danger created a siege mentality in which compromise felt reckless and restraint felt fatal. The concept of inevitability was central. Ideologues argued that conflict was unavoidable, that history itself was moving toward confrontation. If war was destined, then the only rational choice was to prepare for it and to strike under favorable conditions. This logic removed moral hesitation by presenting aggression as a response to destiny rather than a decision. As these ideas gained dominance, they shaped policy and perception simultaneously. Diplomatic setbacks were interpreted as proof of hostility. Economic challenges were seen as evidence of encirclement. Military preparation was no longer controversial but expected. Each development reinforced the belief that Germany was engaged in a struggle for existence rather than a series of negotiable disputes. The language used to describe this struggle was deliberately visceral. The nation was described as a living organism threatened by suffocation. Borders were depicted as wounds that needed healing. Resources were framed as lifeblood. Such metaphors turned abstract policy goals into matters of survival, making opposition feel not merely wrong, but dangerous. This ideological framework also simplified complexity. International politics, with all its nuance and competing interests, was reduced to a binary struggle between strength and weakness. History was rewritten as a continuous contest in which only decisive nations survived. In this simplified world, hesitation became synonymous with decline and aggression with vitality. Over time, this worldview narrowed the range of imaginable futures. Peace appeared fragile and temporary, dependent on the goodwill of others. War, though terrifying, appeared controllable, purposeful, and even cleansing. The longer ideology dominated public and political discourse, the more these assumptions hardened into unquestioned truths. What emerged was a self-reinforcing cycle. Fear justified ideology. Ideology magnified fear. Both together demanded action. Each success validated the narrative, while each obstacle confirmed the sense of persecution. By the time war arrived, it no longer felt like a break from the past, but like the culmination of a story that had been told repeatedly until it felt unavoidable, necessary, and even logical within the frame that had been constructed. Thank you for listening, and don't forget to like and subscribe.